today's Chief Data and Technology Officer Summit session, the second in our six-part series running June through November. I'm Caitlin Halferty, Director of the IBM AI Accelerator and host of our Summit series. In case you missed it, last month we kicked off the summit with Chief Data Officers leading in turbulent times. A very special thank you to our guest speakers, Linda Avery, Chief Data Officer at Verizon, and Anthony Scripignano, Chief Data Scientist at Dun & Bradstreet, for sharing their leadership insights. It was a fantastic session and is available for replay. We received many great questions that we did not have time to address live. We have a blog series that addresses those questions and will continue to do so after each session. So please keep the questions coming throughout today's conversation. We will make sure they either are tackled in our live Q&A or in a follow-up blog for the community. Today we are talking AI ethics and trust. Never has this topic been more important. Per recent research we'll share more about in today's session, 2/3 of executives surveyed believed AI ethics is important. That number jumps to 90% for companies using AI. Many argue it's the greatest opportunity and perhaps man-made threat of our time. So who owns it? How do we reduce algorithmic risk and system bias? AI systems learn and get smarter as they engage with everything your company has in terms of data. How are we protecting that resulting IP? And what does a fourth V, data virtuosity, mean? Finally, how do you coach your employees and teams on data ethics to address trust concerns? These are just some of the fascinating questions today's session addresses. As always, these sessions feature prominent industry leaders that tackle big strategic ideas and that recommend actionable strategies and frameworks that we hope you will find immediately valuable in your own work. Thank you for investing your time to join us today. And with that, let me turn it over to CDO Club CEO Dave Matheson and our IBM Global Chief Data Officer, Inderpal Bhandari. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. We're thrilled to bring you this second session in the IBM CDO Summit Series titled AI Ethics and Trust. I'm David Matheson, the founder and CEO of the CDO Club and CDO Summit. I'm excited to kick off today's program with our featured guest, Inderpal Bhandari, Global Chief Data Officer at IBM. Welcome back, Inderpal.
Nice to be here, Dave.
Inderpal, you've been quoted as saying that we understand AI from a consumer perspective, but not in the enterprise context. And that for enterprise AI to be successful, it has to be core at what enterprises do. Can you explain what you mean by that?
We have a sense as consumers what AI is about and what it can do for us. The examples of Uber and Airbnb and Amazon and Google, they've made that quite familiar to us. How our data is used to propose back products to us, to make things easier for us, etc. But from an enterprise standpoint, people are less clear on where the value is. In our mind, having done that internally for IBM, we know that it lies in infusing AI into every workflow within the company. And I don't just mean the big workflows, I mean every workflow. That's the promise and potential of AI. So wherever you have some decision-making component, if you've got AI infused into that workflow, you're going to end up with a better decision, faster decision, more accurate, cycle time reduction, etc. Then if you think of that as being done at every decision level, you pretty much have that multiplied millions of times across a large enterprise, and that's where the value is. So the example that I like to use is one from my own organization, which is done by somebody who's an entry-level employee, where they label whether or not a client that we're working with is a government-owned entity. And the reason for that is the rules are different globally for how you deal with government-owned entities. And so, we operate ethically and we strive hard to do that. And previously, this was all done manually, a lot of research and so forth. But now, it has AI infused in it.
We had a question last time in our last session from Dr. Paul Palath, and he asked about explainable AI. He said, what are the various approaches you've taken, not just at IBM, but in your career, to create explainable AI?
Yes, so this is one of those very deep fundamental issues around AI. It goes to being able to trust AI. It goes to being able to infuse AI into workflows and so forth. I mean, one of the key aspects of AI, as we look at it from an IBM standpoint, it is white box. It's got to be white box. And the reason it's got to be white box is if it's going to assist somebody in making a decision, a human, they've got to be able to understand it. and it has to be able to explain itself in human terms to the decision maker. And to pick up Dr. Paul's question, I got into this very early in the 1990s when I did this data mining program for the National Basketball Association. And every coach in the NBA started using it to plan strategy for playoff games. And the very first time it came up with a counterintuitive pattern, it wanted the coach to start two backup players in the starting lineup, even though they were 0-2 down in a best of 5 series. And the coach essentially called me and said, how can I do this? So the explainability was not there. And the way we got around it then is we realized that we're missing the context around that pattern. Why, it feels that these two players should be played. And it's not in just the statistics, right? The actual context, so the video. So we brought the video clips together when those players were on the court, and then they could make the decision, move forward, and it was the right decision. Right. So that aspect of stitching together the context now can actually be done automatically. And so that's one aspect that really goes a long way towards being able to explain what it is that the program is finding or recommending. And whoever's making the decision, their job is on the line for that decision. Yes. If it's a surgeon, their job is on the line for doing the right operation. If the system the AI system comes back and says, amputate that leg, they're not just going to go off and do it. Right. They're going to need an explanation. And so this is why explainability is extremely important. Stitching context around the decision is extremely important. One other subtle example. In the case of that government-owned entity, it's not just enough that the system come back and say, hey, this company just got acquired by the government. I just saw the press release, and so factor that in. That's one level of utility that it could bring to the person, but they still would not be able to totally trust it. When the dialogue gets to something like, hey, the founder of this company just got appointed to a high-ranking government committee, and I think that's relevant. Now, the program is actually speaking the human's language. There's a lot more trustworthiness that'll go in there. That explainability in terms of capturing the human essence of what the person's looking for is kind of critical to explainability.
How can we build in user trust when we expand AI's capabilities?
That's a critical point, right? And I like to think of it in 2 dimensions. One dimension is at the level of the provider of the AI technology or capability. The thing with AI systems is it's looking at everything that you have in terms of data, and it's learning from it. And what it ends up learning is really the intellectual capital of the company. If the person who is using it feels that, oh, this is going to disintermediate me, they're not going to work with the program. Right. Similarly for a company, if the company feels this vendor is going to disintermediate me, it's not going to be successful. So there's one level of trust that goes right at that level of the supplier itself, which is why from a policy standpoint, we're very clear from at IBM that the client's data is their data. We will never do anything with it that the client didn't ask us to do. Not only that, any insights that we draw from their data is going to be their insight. So coming back to that government-owned entity example, we wouldn't be like a supplier that says, fine, I'm going to learn from your data. I'm going to then pool it together with everything else we've learned about government-owned entities, and then we'll come up with our own offering. So those things are very clear. They have to be addressed at the level of the provider or the purveyor of the technology or capability to foster trust. So the other dimension is in terms of working with the decision maker and gaining their trust. That's one level where the data transparency has to be critical. The second piece is that it actually be able to explain what it's doing, explain further in a way that it captures and instills human values in it. That was my example about, this guy got appointed to the committee. Isn't that something you want to factor in? Because, there's the perception of a conflict of interest there. It's very, it would be something that a human would draw that conclusion. You have to have a platform that essentially goes at it from a data transparency, lineage, all that stuff, and then explainability, elimination of bias, all the different things that go with being able to explain the finding in a way that not only harks back to what data was looked at, but also the type of reasoning and the techniques that were applied, so that the human looking at it feels like they're really talking with another human. They're able to make a judgment and move forward with that. So I think that all that, when you wrap those two dimensions together, one at the purveyor level and then at the technology level, that's what ends up fostering trust.
In regards to AI, what's next?
And we surveyed board executives. 80% of them, essentially 4 or 5, right? I mean, basically felt that AI, ethics around AI is a board level issue. But only 2 or 5, right, around 40, 45%, felt that they were prepared to actually do something about it. So that's an example of the awareness is there now, the need is recognized, but the education and the expertise is not available at that level. Similarly, on the consumer front, 80% of the people now are like uncomfortable or less comfortable about giving their data. And I think in terms of scaling AI, these issues all have to be addressed. So it comes back to developing a framework around trust. So, at IBM, we came up with AI OpenScale. I mean, it's put forward as a product, but I really think of it as a framework, as an entire framework of building around explainability, bias, trust. And then you couple that with our corporate dimension as to how we position in terms of our contracts and everything else, in terms of data ownership. Then you've got the way, you've got the playbook to move forward.
Thanks again to Inderpal Bhandari for those insightful and useful comments. And next up, I'd like to hand over the controls to Seth Dobrin. He's Chief Data Officer for Cloud and Cognitive Software at IBM, to moderate the panel on AI, ethics, and trust. Over to you, Seth.
Hi, welcome to IBM CDO Summit Series, the virtual one. Today, this panel is going to be discussing a very timely and important topic on AI ethics. What do you think is the biggest issue around AI and trust? And let's start with Joanne.
Sure. So, hi, I'm Joanne Stonier. I'm the Chief Data Officer for MasterCard. I think the issue around AI and trust has to do with the mystery around AI, right? I think for many people, there's questions around how does it work? How can I understand how it comes up with its answers? And how can I trust that a bunch of data scientists actually know what they're doing? And if they get it wrong, how do I correct it?
Excellent. Wonderful. Jerry?
My name is Jerry. I'm the Senior Vice President at Swiss Re Institute, which is the strategy, research, and innovation arm of Swiss Re. The problem with AI is it's become too pervasive, too fast, where it's embedded in really critical functions, from HR to credit decisions, to college admissions, to just about everything, without people understanding the second order effects of it, and also without really understanding the underlying data. So to put it in a simple language, right, if I use a real estate sort of analogy, we are starting to build a building without first digging the foundation and without really understanding the zoning laws, right? So I think that's an issue.
Tim?
Hi, I'm Tim Nagle. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer at U.S. Bank in the Law Division, also working with marketing and analytics and artificial intelligence groups. My concern is that we need to understand what AI is and what it isn't, what its limits are. I think it's being touted as sort of a standalone answer to all problems, but I think there are some limitations we have to understand, and also to make that known to others in the business, in the company, that may not be as familiar with it. So when we ask them about their use of AI, they understand what that means. And then the other concern I have is, does AI in fact create more personal information by its analytics, by its inferences, and by some of the laws that are pending? Do we now include any AI output as part of personal information about an individual, and how do we manage that?
Yes, I'm Francesca Rossi. I'm from IBM, and I'm the AI ethics global leader at IBM. And I would I spell that out into 3 dimensions. One is the capabilities of current AI, the limitations, because people sometimes don't understand that AI is not done. AI still has a lot of limitations, and there are thousands of researchers that are trying, especially to focus on the limitations to overcome them. But so there are capabilities, there are limitations, and then there are risks and concerns to be considered, of course. And as we advance the capabilities, overcome the limitations, we always parallel have to advance, the knowledge and the solutions, technical or non-technical, for the risks. So education about these three dimensions is very important. I also want to reiterate the issue, that the big importance of transparency, which is important, an important dimension for trust. And then lately, because of the COVID situation, of course, the data issues are very important. The privacy issues are very important. At IBM, we meet, 3 times a week about offerings related to the post-COVID situation. And of course, the main concerns are, yes, the usual one, bias, explainability, transparency, and so on, but the privacy one has become much, much more central. And it's important to understand how these privacy concerns, as well as the other one, can go hand in hand with innovation and with solutions that are based on AI.
And I'm Seth Dobrin. I'm the Chief Data Officer for IBM's Cloud and Cognitive Software business. So Joanne, as a Chief Data Officer, and with all your prior experience as a Chief Privacy Officer, what policies have you implemented to ensure that AI is ethical and can be trusted within MasterCard?
It's less about policies. I think it's more about practices as well as policies. Right? AI and machine learning is in its early days. So what we've done at MasterCard, all of our data practices align around making sure that we understand kind of the individual impacts. All of our data design work, whether it's for AI, machine learning, or just typical analytics, is all very individually strict when it's going to have any individual impacts, right? We believe that individuals have to be at the center of our data design practices. So we have our data responsibility principles that really are foundational to ensuring privacy is considered, security is considered, that we really think about things like transparency and accountability that Francesca talked about, as well as the integrity of the data. And we're talking about that very specifically as we think about AI, right? So then look at the inputs, right, the data set that we're using to actually understand what is inherently in the data sets before we actually go into our AI practice, because inherent in data sets are going to be types of bias. We actually have come up with what we're calling our AI governance practice, which I suspect many organizations have come up with, which really looks at, in a series of steps, how do you begin to train everyone around your AI practice.
The second point leads into that I wanted to bring up leads into my next question, which is around model risk and the use of AI to monitor models and assess risk. I think Jerry has a really I know he has a really deep expertise in this space and a unique perspective on how to approach model risk and algorithmic risk at Swiss Re. Can you tell us a little bit about how your company is preparing to combat this and kind of how you leverage these tools and technologies and even your background to address this?
I'm glad you asked this question, and I'm also glad I'm working for a company like Swiss Re, which was, I think, very early on really focused on the governance, privacy, and compliance-related issues of data science. I think digital risk, and I bundle cyber risk and AI risk in that, is probably the single biggest man-made risk of this century, right? And decision-making algorithms are so pervasive today with so little understanding of the biases of underlying data, like Joanne pointed out, and the effects, societal effects of the output, that we just not are in a place where we can say that, we have a good grip on what's going on. If I was to look at how we're doing it at Swiss Re right now, I will break down our sort of activities in 2 buckets. One is the tactical bucket, the other is a strategic bucket. In the tactical bucket, we have operations and training. So in operations, which is, how we develop models, how we absorb data scientists, we are really focused on compliance issues, data privacy issues, and creating really robust processes around who gets access to what data for what purpose in what geography. Because we are a global company, we're actually subject to global regulations. So we have to be really careful about which data is being collected where, for what purposes, and where, when, and how can it be used. And that's a really challenging exercise, which I'm proud to say we do a really good job at. Clearly, it leads to frustrations in some quarters because when the data is available, you want to use it, but clearly for some reason you can't use it. So that's really important. We also do a lot of data analytic work for the benefit of our clients. And so we need to have a really sort of robust policy around how we service those requests, right? So it's about explainability, like Joanne pointed out, which is really important, right? I mean, 6-7 years ago when I started out in data science, 7 years ago, it was all about AUC, it was all about accuracy. Interpretability didn't really matter that much, but to a certain extent, it was not a big deal because you were running simpler models, you were running regressions and clustering and all of those things. Today, we are running really complex models with layers upon layers upon layers, where you might be starting with simpler models, but by the time you get to the end output, you have made so many changes, so many permutations and combinations that interpretability becomes difficult. And Seth, you pointed out yourself that bias detection is not a well-established science right now, though I am hopeful, as a sidebar, one of the projects we're doing with IBM addresses that in a pretty short term. The second piece is training, and training is really important. Cyber and data hygiene are core training, core requirements for our employees. And we supplement that with, we don't just train and give them certificates, we also test them. So throughout the year, employees will get spam emails and stuff like that, and we test how they respond, and that guides us of how good our training is. So that's the tactical bucket, which I think most organizations to a small or large degree are doing. But I think where we really invest a lot of our hard dollars is in the strategic bucket, which is the research and thought leadership piece, and the second piece is new product development. So in research and thought leadership, we partner with leading organizations, for example, MIT, EPFL, and others, to research how to make AI more explainable and trustable. One thing which I think we do really well is, even though we do a lot of work in trustability and explainability of models, we spend a lot of time and effort and resources trying to figure out a way where the underlying data is virtuous. So we already know about the 4 V's of data. Virtuosity wasn't part of the 4 V's, but we've added that, which is really important because if the underlying data is virtuous, it addresses a lot of problems, right? And Francesca also alluded to it, which is, the data is not right, then what do you do? And the final piece is new product development. And that's one area where I think we will see some movement in the next 6 to 8 months. We are actually working with you guys at IBM and working on developing a solution to better understand and manage the risk of decision-making algorithms. And we are working with your open scale teams, and we're working with your promontory teams. So we are very excited about that project. We're investing a lot of resources, a lot of time, and we are very excited about the collaboration.
Tim, you have a unique perspective from the rest of us in that not only you're a chief privacy officer and associate general counsel at US Bank, and as we emerge into this world the last couple of years of increasing data privacy regulations, it's not hard to imagine at all that the next stage of that is AI regulation. And how do you at US Bank, and then you as a chief privacy officer and a well-practiced attorney, think about operating in the context of both data privacy and AI, expected and upcoming AI regulation?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And because I work with the digital marketing people, the chief analytics officer, always have the privacy consideration, and working with the chief innovation officer as well, who owns part of our AI portfolio. I'm kind of get to see the whole package or the whole process, and ultimately the result, I think for all of us, is better insight about a problem, a process, a customer, a potential customer, or a need that we can help them with or help identify or get ahead of. So it's all about driving more insight, and AI is going to give us that sharper, clear insight and derive it from data sets that we previously wouldn't be able to do. I asked couple months ago, I asked our artificial intelligence lead about the risks of using artificial intelligence. And he said, Tim, there are two. The first one is the risk of using it, and the second one is the risk of not using it. So I think for any company or for any government or for any purpose, any academic institution, any hospital, I guess I would just say, know how you're using artificial intelligence, know why you're using it, and be comfortable with that, and have some basic criteria or considerations that guide you to be comfortable with it. So we look at AI sort of two different ways within the bank. One is sort of the application of AI, which our analytics team's doing with machine learning, artificial intelligence, putting against internal challenges. And then we also have the innovation team looking around the corner. Where's AI going? Where should it go? Where do we want to go with it? But if you step back, I think there are two sets of considerations. The first one is, okay, the AI, we can do it. We have the technical means, we have the algorithms, we can make it work, and it's accurate. We've tested the models, we've done the bias testing. The output is in fact actionable, accurate information that we can use. The second piece is it's helpful. The answer we get actually gets us to where we want to be or helps us derive more insight, and it's good. The most important question, especially in the ethics space, is yes, but should we? Should we be using this kind of data? Should we be using the tool of artificial intelligence or machine learning to crack this problem? If it's regulatory or cyber or fraud or internal process improvement, that's a little bit easier calculation to make because it doesn't affect a person or shouldn't affect a person. It's process improvement. But then we have to look at the second piece, and that is, I think, what you alluded to, the evolving legal standards. So I think some of the regulators in the financial services industry have looked at, we already have laws, we already have regulations on the use of analytics, on risk evaluation. Where does AI fit in there? Do we have to create something new, or does this fit in with what we're already doing? We've heard about some laws that are being developed in the privacy and other spaces that talk about, are we deriving insight? Are we using analytics? Is that fully disclosed? And I leave it to others in the robo-advisor space to understand that process and be able to explain it to the consumer or to the user internally. So those will continue to evolve, the laws, the regulations. And so internally, you say we have to do that, obviously, and we have to identify, quantify, and address the risks. So you have laws, you have regulations, you have risks. What's on top of that? To me, that's ethics. We've addressed all the requirements and we've done the risk calculation. Should we be doing this? Is this defensible? Is this something that's consistent with our core values? Our chief ethics officer is very involved in our decisioning on the use of artificial intelligence. But there also is an external consideration. In some discussions with investor relations and investor groups, they're starting to focus on the data. What do you have? Who do you share it with? What are you using it for? And I anticipate that artificial intelligence and machine learning and analytics generally is going to be part of that discussion, because I'm seeing the evolution of investor concerns and corporate governance going in the direction away from the purely financial considerations, which are always going to be there, into the what are you doing? What are you doing with it? Is that the right thing to do? Is it the kind of company that I want to invest in or be part of, for that matter? We're new in this space. Obviously, the algorithms, the technology, the math behind this is very old, but actually applying it is evolving. And we're trying to think ahead of the problem of what's the right thing to do, what's a defensible position on ethics and artificial intelligence. If we're doing something, we're asked about it, what is our position? How did we get to the decision to apply artificial intelligence to a particular problem? And are we comfortable with that? Is our board comfortable with that? Internally, who makes that call? Is that one person? Is that a group of people? Does it feel right? And we also want to make sure that all of our employees, whether involved directly in AI or in customer relationship or technology or anything, understand what artificial intelligence is generally and know where they can go to ask the question, hey, we're going to do this. Is this a good thing? Should we be comfortable with this? Is there a different way? And are we fully knowledgeable of what we're doing? So the beauty is there's no right answer and no wrong answer. The downside is the same thing. There's no right answer and wrong answer. So I'm glad we're having sessions like this to try to talk through it. Thank you.
So Francesca, you're the global AI ethics leader here at IBM. What is most important to ethically harness the power of AI?
The properties of the technology are very important. It's also very important all the pieces that you need to put in place around these properties of the technology. So that's why I pushed so much within IBM and to build these pieces of governance like the internal AI ethics board, where, as you know, all the representative and high executives from all the various divisions of the company are represented there, and they discuss together, for the various issues that they try to help coordinate and help the business units understand what are the guidelines and also what are the dimensions along which the company would like to assess the risks of the various future offerings. The last thing that I want to say is that this report is also very important because really we heard so far so many different points of view around AI ethics, the academics, but not much about what the companies really think is important for them and can be impactful in their operations and for their clients. So that's why we put together this analysis of what the companies were thinking.
And that analysis will be available. There'll be a link provided, or is a link provided as part of this webinar. What role do you see human in the loop in the successful and ethical implementation of AI in enterprises?
So yeah, so as you know, IBM thinks that the goal of AI is to augment human intelligence rather than replacing. So, because of course, the more you have human supervision and the more you can, in some sense, mitigate something like that the technology can do that is not aligned with what are the values and what are the goals of the particular setting. But of course, it's not that by putting a human there, you are done. You have to educate that human being, that user, to understand what the AI system is giving as output to him and how to interpret that. This is a statistically based, probabilistic based. We know the humans naturally are not very good at interpret it in the right way.
So you think about the output of AI, machine learning, and you think about the features that were developed or the combinations of data, we call features, that were developed to build that AI. How do you govern them as part of your data governance process, or do you even? And how do you ensure that you assign the right level of criticality and protection to that? Let's start with Jerry.
The answer really boils down to before you start any data science project, you have to ask yourself one critical question, which is how important is interpretability for this model, right? We are a regulated industry. We are in a highly regulated environment. Interpretability becomes really, really, really important for us. And so when you start doing feature engineering, there are different layers of feature engineering. If you're simply doing summation or division and stuff, by and large, you can still explain it. So for example, if you take the Moneyball example, if you've seen the movie, they came up with a new feature called run difference, right? Which is runs they scored versus runs that were scored against them. It's a new feature, easily explainable. You can run a bunch of analytics on it. You can explain it to regulators. It's not impermissible, right? The problem comes when you start getting into complex feature engineering. You're taking vectors, square roots, and all of those things. That becomes really, really difficult to explain, right? Where if you cannot explain the feature, it is best to not use it in a model if you need to explain it to a regulator, right? So the first question you ask is, how much of this is, what's the interpretability versus accuracy mix? Where do you, on which side of the continuum do you want to be? And if interpretability becomes a important attribute for the output of the model, then you, by and large, stick to simpler feature engineering type exercises. In terms of permissibility, it's a really interesting question. I think it was Tim who mentioned about the credit score and things of that nature. I'll tell you, a few years ago, you could do things which could be proxies for impermissible features, and people wouldn't really know about it. And frankly, even you as a data scientist would not know about it, right? But I think regulators have become sophisticated now. Executives have become sophisticated now. So you have to be very careful that when you are doing feature engineering exercises, you're not creating a feature that is a proxy for a prohibited feature. For example, if you are in a underwriting environment or insurance environment, redlining is really important. And there are certain features that you just cannot use in those decisions: race, ethnicity, age, things of that nature. And so when you do feature engineering, and let's say as part of your data set, you have some demographic information, and that demographic information correlates to race, or it correlates to religion, it correlates to something, it becomes really tricky. I don't do any hands-on work for the last couple of years, but one way I was always checking again these things was to look at correlations and say, hey, if we have impermissible features and we have done feature engineering, let's create a correlation covariance matrix. Let's see how it's stacking up. If there's a high correlation with an impermissible feature, it doesn't mean you throw it away, but you have to take a look at it and you have to do it. The other piece that I'm a big advocate for is what I call a Hippocratic oath for data scientists, right? So data science is now more than just a technology exercise, right? Data scientists are creating models that are making life-changing decisions for people, right? So if you are looking for a house and your underwriting model rejects you for some reason, now you can buy a house in a neighborhood with good schools and you have to buy someplace else. That's a generational life-changing decision, right? And so there needs to be an equivalent for a Hippocratic oath for data scientists. And that's one area that we are actively researching and working with some large corporations to advocate for that, to develop some sort of a structure where data scientists know what's permissible versus not, right? It's difficult to standardize that given the fact that we're still early in the process, but we feel it's important for large organizations to start on that exercise, adhere to a certain code of ethic, and data scientists have to say, yes, I subscribe to that code of ethic, and this is my equivalent of a Hippocratic oath, and then you can hold them accountable, responsible, because the current mentality, which is a hacker's mentality, where as long as you're getting high accuracy, anything goes, I think that's very dangerous. It is not a generalized statement because there's some industries. So if you are doing personalization at Netflix, the cost of these things is not high. But if you are doing credit decisions, if you're doing college admissions, if you are in a security services doing feature recognition and detecting behavior that you would pull people aside for further questioning, those are serious things, and we need to everybody in the entire ecosystem needs to adhere to some standards, right from data sourcing to model creation to the person who signs off and says yes, deploy it, right? And so that's why it becomes really important for all of us, and again, we are working together on this at IBM and us, along with others, to really bear down on this. Again, let's not keep adding floors to our data science building before we have fully dug the basement and we know what the zoning laws are.
That's fantastic. One of the things I love about these panels is we get responses that go very different than what I was expecting, and that was a really good, valuable kind of, I don't want to call it a tangent, but into the Hippocratic Oath for data science. I think it's a great concept. Joanne, you want to provide your perspective on any of that, plus the original question I asked?
It's such a great conversation. So I'm really thrilled to be participating and listening. And so everyone in the value chain of product creation It's if it's going to be personally impactful, and whether we're talking in a healthcare perspective, a financial perspective, or just what is the impact to the individual this will eventually be applied to. You need to understand that, and then you need to go through the various steps to make sure that you're doing all different steps. Of my colleagues have done such an eloquent job of talking through. But everybody throughout the chain of command of the different data steps needs to be aligned and understand that this is what we're doing together, right? Those are things that we have to train, because these are still things that are not being trained in school yet, because bias is still, I think, the newest part of the science, right? I think we train on the mathematics a lot. We train on the methodologies a lot, which, let's face it, and when I was in school, we didn't train that well in that yet, right? Data was still, you know, an unknown field. But I think we're getting better as a society, as professionals. I support the Hippocratic Oath, but I think we are embarking on knowledge and on a profession that's getting better every day. And I think the organizations are so hopeful for what we can happen when we get it right. But if we get it wrong, it's not going to be the big advancement that will be wrong. It'll be the personal impact, which Tim talked about, that will be the harder thing to unravel, right? Because the explainability of all of this is super important, and why I think responsible data organizations are taking the time now to do the training, to do the governance, to document what we each are doing, and take the time to do the training.
Both you and Jerry mentioned simplicity. And oftentimes when I bring in new data scientists or even talk to clients, right, they want to do deep learning. And oftentimes the solution is a regression or a simple classification.
Yeah.
And it's really about Occam's razor. Keep it simple. All right, great. I want to once again thank the panelists, Joanne, Jerry, Tim, and Francesca, for the wonderful insights that came out of that panel. I want to give us the opportunity to take some questions. We had a couple that came in before the session, and we'll run through those. And then if we have time, we'll get to some of the questions that came up in the live chat. So Joanne, you mentioned implementing tools to educate employees. Within MasterCard, what tools have you implemented to educate your employees on the area of AI ethics? And this came up actually as one of the polling questions.
Oh, okay, sure. So I think as part of the conversation, we were talking about kind of all the data professionals from product development on up. And I think we mentioned that, that there's such an opportunity to incorporate AI, right, across so many different areas. And so I think all of our employees get exposed now to the whole idea of data, fit for purpose, data quality, right, as it relates to AI and as well as it relates to analytics generally. And so there's now a much broader conversation about what data is right for your analysis, is right for your product. And so we do a whole bunch of basic training. And what we're starting to do now is talk about bias as part of our basic data training across the enterprise as part of ethical data use. Now, there's additional training that we do, obviously, for our data scientists. And it's closer to what Jerry was talking about, a kind of this responsibility that we need our scientists and analysts to do, as well as all of our data professionals, those that source new data, that actually create the data sets. So all of this is beginning to gel around this notion of ethical data use, and then really the review of the output, right? So once we have the actual product or solution, is it really achieving what we intended it to? So one of the things we're also doing is using observational AI for that explainability moment, right? So that we can actually understand what is actually happening within the series of features, and is each feature doing what we wanted it to do? And then in tandem together, is the product or solution actually coming up with the right outputs? If we look at the drift in the models and everything else, so what is the explainability? So all of this together begins to become part of our training. We also have now, we've started looking at what about the vendors we use that use AI, because we're recognizing that there's a whole host of other organizations, and to Jerry's point, we haven't really all built the same foundation, right? We have a lot of tall buildings going up, doing different pieces of AI. So we now also are doing training on if your vendor is coming in and wants to offer an AI solution, what's the right vetting for AI? All of this together begins to build your ethical AI. We also have AI vetting as part of an AI governance process, an ethical AI council that begins to work together as well across disciplines such as privacy, security, data science, the head of our AI practice, as well as our different business teams that build our data products and solutions, as well as some of our O&T colleagues, technology colleagues who are in charge of the infrastructure to make sure that we're all working together to vet our products. We haven't yet reached out to outside experts. I know that some organizations are doing that, but it's certainly on the horizon for us as well. So that's just kind of a whole bunch of different efforts that we have going on. It is an interesting point in time, though. I think that we're also using the whole notion of bias as a jumping off place for some of the work that we need to do just in society at large, to talk about how bias creeps in and it's kind of unintentional. It's in the files of our society today, right? And it shows up in our data sets. So it's also kind of an interesting moment to talk about how bias gets created. It's just kind of there, but if we're aware of it, we also can then change the unintended consequences of some of the data sources. So that's also been very interesting at this particular moment in time, given all of the kind of unintended racial impacts, gender impacts that we're seeing. And we also are trying to make sure that we have diverse teams so that we don't have things like confirmation bias showing up in our products and solutions. Just because we also know that that's another issue that we have to take on from making sure that we have diverse teams working on different projects and solutions.
Great, thanks, Joanne. Yeah, diversity is incredibly important. We really believe that. I know all of us do. So Jerry, how has the COVID-19 pandemic shifted the AI ethics strategy at Swiss Re?
You know, as I also mentioned in my earlier comments, you know, we have been focused on ethics, privacy, compliance for a really long time. So from a ethics or compliance perspective, things have not changed. But if you'd allow me, I think where I think we have seen things really stand out, if I break it into people's, process, technology, what we have done is we have accelerated some of the filling of some of the positions we had, right? So we have a chief data officer, chief digital officer, and we have filled those positions over the last couple of months. And so what that does is it puts a face to the policies. It puts a leadership team that you can reach out for questions, who can give you guidance. So these are not just amorphous policies developed by the compliance team. There's actually a face to it. There's a vision behind it. There's a strategy behind it. From a process point of view, you know, we have fairly robust processes. We had, and we still continue to have robust policies around what kind of data we can use, who has access to which applications, who can work on what, who gets access to what, and for what duration. So the toolkit we have is pretty robust, and I'm sure our compliance team continues to work on that. The thing that, to my mind, was a big revelation to me was on the technology piece, which is, you know, 6 months ago, most of us, to a certain extent, were complaining that, you know, we can't access Gmail from our work computer, we can't do this, we can't do that. What we have realized over the last 2-3 months is, because we have such robust policies and such great technology tools in place, as a person who's been working from home for the last 4 months, 3.5, 4 months, I have not seen any drop in productivity, because we have the tools and technology that allow us to work from home. And it's the same with all my colleagues. So when I talk to my colleagues in Zurich or Armonk or Bangalore or anywhere else, some of them tell me the productivity has actually gone up, right? So to answer your question, things have not changed. What has happened is we have realized the importance of the processes and tools and technologies we had. So this has been a wake-up call for all of us, obviously, and we are glad that we had the right tools and technologies in place.
Great, thanks, Jerry. So Tim, in your journey leading these efforts, or you're part of the efforts at US Bank, how did you get buy-in from stakeholders around your strategy?
Thanks. I think naturally people are going to participate in or buy into things that they understand and they're comfortable with. So most of you on this session are probably AI practitioners. You understand the technology, you understand limitations, but you need to help your colleagues understand it. And I'm not saying proselytize or talk down to them, but just help them understand the function, the means, and the output of artificial intelligence and machine learning so they feel comfortable with it in their respective areas. Joanne alluded to vendors and partners. How do we evaluate their AI as they provide services to us within IP considerations? The risk team, the compliance team, the board, the legal team, the business lines especially, help them understand what artificial intelligence does at a high level and how it basically fits in with what they're already doing and how it improves what they're doing. So to me, buy-in is familiarization. So we're all in a little bit of ways as we try to improve or expand the AI journey is helping our colleagues understand, helping them how it's relevant to their business or their process, and providing them a means to ask questions of any kind, stupid or otherwise, so that they can then be sort of an active participant and feel comfortable with something that could be fairly esoteric to many. So that's what I'm trying to do within the law division and at the bank generally.
Great, thanks, Tim. I don't think there are any stupid questions, especially in this topic area. Francesca, you wrote a good report that we have posted up here on advancing AI ethics. Who, and what title is responsible for ensuring that ethics and trust are integrated into companies' AI?
That's one of the questions that we asked explicitly to the people that responded to the questionnaire. There were more than 1,500 executives from companies of many different sectors all over the world. And to that question, well, first of all, we asked if they think that AI ethics issues are board level topics. And 4 out of 5, as Inderpal also mentioned at the beginning, yes, they said yes, this is a board level issue. But they also said, many of them, that they didn't feel really prepared in their company to understand what to do with that topic at the board level. And then, as you say, we asked, okay, but who is responsible? Who should be responsible in the company? And most of them, they identified technical roles, like the CTO. So as if they're thinking that the AI ethics solution should mostly be, I mean, that's my inference, they didn't say that explicitly, there should mostly be kind of technical solution, which of course, those are, a large part of the solutions, but they're not the only ones. You need many other kinds of solution and roles to be involved in order to find really the right kind of way to address these issues. So technical solutions to me are one piece of the whole ecosystem around AI ethics in a company, but you need many more than that. And instead, from this survey, it seems that there is this perception that this is a technical issue and should be solved by a technical role. So I think that even in that space, there is a lot of improvement to be done based on education, I think.
We did the same thing. We put an IBM fellow in charge of AI ethics at IBM.
Yeah, but as you know, the AI ethics board has all sorts of people, even from all the divisions, technical and non-technical. So and we really work a lot with many different stakeholders, even externally at IBM. So we really believe that this is a multi-stakeholder, a multidisciplinary effort, cannot just be handled by technical people only.
Great. So we're running at the top of the hour here. I wanted to real quick just end on a positive note and ask all the panelists, how can society best harness AI for good? Why don't we start with Joanne?
Oh, wow. There's so many opportunities, right? I mean, COVID alone tells us that, processing so much data, right? AI can do a really good job of processing data for helping with the pandemic. Crisis response, right? One of the things that we work on MasterCard is being able to provide emergency responders with data in anticipation of and then in response to weather events, right? So we know that AI can do an awful lot with taking information and patterns of information and then providing information in anticipation of similar events, right? So just that alone, we know that we can be better prepared for all sorts of climactic events and then the aftermath of how to help people after hurricanes, tornadoes, things like that, to help communities get back on their feet. I can't imagine that once we go through this kind of crisis that the world's experiencing, we can't get better at also being prepared for future health crises as well. So,
great. Thanks. Tim?
Thanks. I mean, AI is very powerful, can be very powerful, so it can give us a lot of insights. But I think having discussions like this, where you apply ethics to sophisticated analytics, is going to be important for society. So we can, how are we doing it? Should we be doing it? Why are we doing it? Continuing to have these discussions, I think in any context, healthcare, technology, services, anything, the mere fact that we're considering ethics as part of a highly sophisticated technology is going to be important for all analytics. So I think just continuing to have these discussions is going to be very important for societal interest.
Thanks. And Jerry, finally?
I mean, AI is here to stay. We know based on research that you guys at IBM have done and McKinsey has done, it's going to contribute up to 36 trillion to the global economic output by 2025. Or is it 2030? So clearly the benefits are, in my mind, outweigh the risk. From a consumer point of view, you know, it's going to help make things simpler and faster. From the government point of view, I think there are a lot of opportunities for better governance if we can figure out the information asymmetry piece of it. And for enterprise, you know, the data is pretty clear. It is helping productivity. What we are missing right now is new product and solutions taking advantage of AI, but we'll see that as well.
Thanks, Jerry. I would once again like to thank all of you, Jerry, Joanne, Tim, and Francesca, for participating in this fabulous panel. I learned a lot from all of you, and I hope everyone on the webinar learned a lot as well. I'm going to real quick hand it over to Caitlin to wrap it up, and we'll see you next month.
Perfect. Thank you, Seth. Thanks again to our panelists. The quality really comes down to all of the insights that you've shared. This has been fantastic. And our participants, if you've been tracking the chat, there's a lot of great comments. Really looking forward to this code of conduct with respect to data ethics and some collateral that others have committed to sending, which is great. We'll make sure and get it out to the community. And just a reminder, our next session, please do book your calendar, is August 12th. Noon Eastern. We'll be talking about the role of data officers and technology officers and the importance of those connections and really driving data-driven technology initiatives. So looking forward to that. Thank you again for joining us today. If we didn't have a chance to answer questions or comments posted in the chat, we'll make sure and collect them, get those in a blog, and get those out to the community. So thank you very much, and talk with you soon.